No matter where we go, it is pretty much impossible not to see someone with an iPhone. And there definitely are many people that are watching this video that have or are iPhone owners. Maybe even watching this video on an iPhone. It is something that's anticipated by hundreds of thousands of even millions of people. Over the years, we've been growing opinions about how the iPhone is. Has it changed for the better or for the worst? Some believe that the innovation department of the iPhone is slowing down, and some don't really care, they just want a simple experience. So let's take a look back and see how the iPhone has changed over the years. This is the evolution of the iPhone. So first off, how did Apple exactly go from making music players and computers to now making a phone? Well, this is how it started. So before mainstream tablets like the iPad, in the very early 2000s, Microsoft actually created a tablet PC. This tablet infuriated co-founder Steve Jobs. The reason is because it uses a stylus instead of your fingers. After some time, Steve assembled a team of Apple engineers to start work on a concept for a multi-touch tablet. But work shifted when Jobs was sitting in a coffee shop with future original developer for software of the iPhone, Scott Forstall, noticing around that people were displeased at their cell phones. Scott asked Jobs on the possibility of adding multi-touch to a phone, and after this discussion, the idea of the iPhone was born. People noticed that the domain iphone.org was acquired by Apple. In the past, this link would take you right to Apple's website. In 2002, on September 11th, Steve Jobs inadvertently answered a question about if there will be an iPhone. Steve Jobs' response was, "One never knows. We don't usually discuss products that we haven't announced," technically indirectly answering that the iPhone is happening. Then Apple began putting trademarks on the iPhone in different countries. And believe it or not, in 2005, Apple actually did make a phone. Clearly it wasn't the iPhone, it was a phone that they teamed up with Motorola to make, which is called the iTunes phone. That didn't really go far, and Apple and Motorola split their ways soon. Then for the iPhone, Apple would partner up with AT&T to make them an exclusive carrier for a little bit. And on January 9th of 2007, the iPhone was announced and would be released on June 29th. With a price of $500. Of course, back then the huge flagship features was surfing on the web with a real internet-like experience, because other phones had like that internet that wasn't really the internet, listening to your music, and most importantly at the time, the display itself. But Apple created a technology called multi-touch, which allowed for multiple fingers to be on the screen to do certain gestures. As for specs, the iPhone had a 1400 mAh battery, a 320 by 480 pixel resolution, a 3.5-inch screen, a 2 megapixel camera, 128 megabytes of RAM, and a 4 GB, 8 GB, and 16 GB storage size. The iPhone 3G was Apple's answer to one big issue with the original, that being that it's too expensive. If only they waited a decade, am I right? So Apple created one that was more affordable and goes to more countries, supports 3G, and of course, now has the App Store. So with that, it opened a whole new door for people to get an iPhone. The iPhone 3G had a 1150 mAh battery, a 480 by 320 pixel resolution, a 3.5-inch display, a 2 megapixel camera, 128 megabytes of RAM, and an 8 GB and 16 GB model. This would also be the first iPhone to be followed up by an S model. And most of the updates basically made the phone faster, and also the camera was updated to 3 megapixels, and there is video. The iPhone 4 would become one of Apple's most important iPhones ever. On the iPhone 4, a front-facing camera was added so that we can talk with other people with FaceTime. During that time, FaceTime was such a big thing. Even though there were services like it, doing it with the iPhone just felt different. Nowadays, it feels as common to do as just calling someone, really. Other than that, this would be the first iPhone to have Apple's popular Retina display, as well as a very clean and new design, which still, I have to say, feels modern. The specs for the iPhone 4 include a 1420 mAh battery, a 640 by 960 pixel resolution, a 3.5-inch display, The camera on the back was 5 megapixels, and the camera on the front was 0.3 megapixels. It has 512 megabytes of RAM and an 8GB, 16GB, and 32GB storage. For the iPhone 4S, it would introduce Siri, which is another one of those things that we don't necessarily use that much. Of course, back then we marveled at it so much, but Siri definitely was a step forward for introducing AI like Alexa. This also would unfortunately be the last iPhone that Steve Jobs would witness. Not the last one that he would work on though. By speculation, the iPhone 5 is to be Steve Jobs' last iPhone that he worked on. Some rumors say that it could have been the 5S or the 6, but most believe it was the 5. The main features associated with the iPhone 5 included a taller screen, allowing for users to use one hand with it, but Apple did something that most users at the time were not really happy with, which was changing the charger. The only two positive outcomes I saw from changing the charger is that now you can charge your phone either way of the side, and also it's smaller. That's basically it. The design of the headphones were also changed so it could universally fit almost any ear. The specs on the iPhone 5 include a 1440 mAh battery, a 640 by 1136 pixel resolution, a 4-inch display, a back camera with 8 megapixels, and a front camera with 1.2 megapixels, and 1GB of RAM, and the storage was upgraded to 16, 32, and 64 gigabytes of storage. As for the iPhone 5S, it would be the first iPhone to have Touch ID, Apple's very own fingerprint home button. Also, a bonus iPhone called the iPhone 5C, similar to the 3GS, was a more affordable model which automatically killed the 4S. The iPhone 6's biggest feature, no pun intended, was that it was made bigger, and even bigger. Even though there were phones before it with that size, the 6 and 6 Plus were extremely successful. Of course, many of you probably remember Bendgate, which honestly, common sense tells us just don't sit down on a flat surface and don't have the phone in your back pocket, because that will clearly make anything like that bend. Other than that though, you can film in slow motion, and also Apple announced Apple Pay, their digital wallet. As for specs, the regular iPhone 6 has a 1800 mAh battery, a 1334 by 750 pixel resolution, along with a 4.7-inch display, an 8 megapixel back-facing camera, and a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, and 1GB of RAM. The iPhone 6 Plus has a 2900 mAh battery, a 1920 by 1080p pixel resolution, a 5.5-inch display, and both of these phones come in 16GB, 32GB, 64GB, and 128GB of storage. For the 6S, the biggest addition was 3D Touch, which also introduces something new called taptic feedback. And other than that, you can take videos in 4K. The iPhone 7 definitely has become the most controversial iPhone ever. This was Apple's great attempt to try and copy what Steve Jobs did, which was taking risks. Unfortunately though, for some fans, the risk that they took was not necessary at all, and if anything, they took away from the user experience. So by now, everyone should know that Apple removed the headphone jack from the iPhone 7, and it was very much a huge uproar, I think even bigger than the charger being changed. For those who enjoyed listening to music and charging their iPhones, they now needed a dongle, which is actually a top seller even till this day at Best Buy. So Apple's tactic actually worked well. People eventually just gave up. Other than that, the iPhone 7 has a non-clickable home button, it uses taptic feedback, and other than that, they added stereo speakers. The design was changed just a little bit, and they added a dual camera to the Plus. The 7 is also the first iPhone to be water resistant. As for the spec department, the normal iPhone 7 has a 1960 mAh battery, a 1334 by 750 pixel resolution, a 12 megapixel back-facing camera, and a 7 megapixel front-facing camera, a 4.7-inch display, and 2GB of RAM. As for the iPhone 7 Plus, it has a 2900 mAh battery, a 1920 by 1080 pixel resolution, a 5.5-inch display, 3GB of RAM, and a 32, 128, and 256GB storage option. Because of the iPhone's birthday, Apple stopped the S line for the first time ever. Instead, they released two phones, the iPhone 8 and iPhone X. The iPhone 8 caught up finally with other smartphones and added wireless charging, special lighting effects into the camera, and now the back is glossy similar to the iPhone 4/4S, and it can shoot up to 4K in 60 FPS, and yeah, that's it. The specs for the regular iPhone 8 include a 1800 mAh battery, a 1334 by 750 pixel resolution, a 4.7-inch display, and 2GB of RAM. For the Plus, it has a 2600 mAh battery, a 1920 by 1080 pixel resolution, a 5.5-inch display, a 12-megapixel camera on the back, and a 7-megapixel camera on the front, 3GB of RAM, and a 64 and 256GB storage option. It's pretty obvious that Apple is putting most of their time into the iPhone X, which is Apple's anniversary iPhone. Its biggest feature of all is the display, as it covers most of the phone except for the notch, which became infamous. This is the first iPhone to officially not have a home button and Touch ID, and also the first iPhone but not first phone to have face recognition technology. Other than that, there's another feature. It's not really useful. It's called Animojis. As for specs, the iPhone X has a 2436 by 1125 pixel resolution, a 2700 mAh battery, 3GB of RAM, and a 5.8-inch display, a 12-megapixel camera on the back, and a 7-megapixel camera on the front. As for storage, it is 64 to 256GB. And just recently, Apple announced the iPhone XR, XS, and XS Max. The XS has a 5.8-inch display, the XR has a 6.1-inch display, and the XS Max has a 6.5-inch display. So while the XR might seem like it's bigger, it's actually the same size as the iPhone 8, except the screen is bigger. The XR is Apple's cheapest iPhone to have the bezel-less display, and it comes in a range of colors similar to the iPhone 5C. And it has a new type of display called the Liquid Retina display, which basically means that it uses an LCD panel instead of an OLED. Other than that, Apple updated the depth for the cameras, and yeah, these are just S models, so you're not going to see any huge crazy features. But if you wanted to go all out and get the most expensive iPhone, the XS Max with 512GB would be almost $1,500. So yeah, we've come a long way, and Apple has changed a lot. And so have their iPhones. Whether that's a good or bad decision is up to the consumers, but it is really interesting to see how much this product has changed. And although every year recently I've been nodding my head at the iPhones, I still am looking forward to see the future of the iPhone. Whether it's going in the direction that I want or not, I'll still always look back to where it all started. And that is being the phone that changed everything. The original iPhone would become the phone that would pave the way for smartphones. It may not have been the first smartphone, but it was definitely the smartphone that made smartphones more mainstream. And with the help of Johnny Ive, it showed that design was extremely important, and not just the product, as he had done before the iPhone. And with that being said, and because of the iPhone's beginning track record, it is safe to say that one of the most important inventions of our generation is the iPhone.